Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be focusing on the 80th anniversary of the United Nations and the role it plays in helping to create a better world. My guest is an expert on this topic. Ms. Rebecca Shute is an international lawyer and democracy and governance practitioner with extensive experience supporting human rights, democratic processes, and the rule of law on 5 continents. She's a co-convener of the Pact Coalition on Strengthening International Judicial Institutions. Previously, she led leadership roles at Citizens for Global Solutions, the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiatives, Parliamentarians for Global Action, and the National Democratic Institute. Rebecca Shute, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be back, and it's a wonderful way to spend the end of the year with you. And what a year it's been, as I think we'll discuss.
It has been a remarkable year in many respects, right? Well, let's start off right at the top. The UN is celebrating its 80th anniversary, which is no small feat in this world today. It was created, let's see, June 26, 1945. What have you, well, focus on a little bit on what the UN's doing as far as this UN 80 anniversary operation, the UN 80 initiative, and how does it tie into the Pact for the Future? First off, what is each one? Let's start off with that, a basic definition.
Sure. Well, I'll start off by saying that I think this anniversary of the 80th year of the UN system is not just the reason to celebrate an institution, but has really been taken by the UN itself, by its civil society partners, and by states as an opportunity to reaffirm and perhaps re-examine the promise of multilateralism. So the UN 80 agenda is a phenomenon that has come out this year and draws very closely and is linked to the Pact for the Future, which was adopted by states last year in 2024. But they operate at different levels of the multilateral system. So the Pact for the Future, which was adopted by consensus by all member states, is fundamentally a political compact. And so it sets out what governments agreed that the world must do differently. And it's organized around 5 chapters within the Pact itself, and it has 2 annexes, a global digital compact and a declaration for future generations. And the Pact contains 56 commitments organized around 5 chapters. And then the UN 80 initiative, which was launched by the Secretary General this year, is in a way about institutional delivery. So if the Pact for the Future is what we should be doing differently as a multilateral system, as states, and as those who work with them, the UN 80 initiative is, bluntly speaking, put large, how this UN system itself must change to make those commitments real. And it has 3 core components. It has system-wide mandate review, operational efficiencies and consolidation, and a exploration of deeper structural and programmatic realignment. And this has 87 commitments in 31 packages. And no, this isn't an SAT question, and there won't be a quiz on it. But so Pact for the Future is the political North Star, and UN 80 provides the institutional engine.
Those are all laudable goals that we should all strive, and probably every organization. Well, what will it take for the United Nations and UN 80th to be successful in achieving and reforming multilateralism? Because we see it's under attack right now. There have been many structural changes. So many of the members, the 193 members of the UN General Assembly, are not playing a constructive role at the UN, and the UN has to have its members participate if it's going to be successful. But what can be done to achieve success?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head about the political landscape and the environmental backdrop under which this is playing out. These processes are not occurring in vacuums. And so for UN 80 to succeed, I think it must first be understood as a political and normative reform process, not simply a managerial or technocratic one. And while efficiency matters, especially given the resource constraints and scarcities that the UN is currently confronting, efficiency without effectiveness risks hollowing out multilateralism further rather than strengthening it. So the ultimate test, I think, will not be whether UN 80 trims budgets as it will, or consolidates structures as it will, but whether it enables the UN to better protect peace, human rights, and human dignity. And so, practically speaking, and I was in a briefing yesterday with Undersecretary Guy Ryder, who is in charge of the UN 80 agenda, and these were the recommendations that I and other civil society partners came up with. Member states must provide sustained political backing, including the willingness to modernize mandates. Secondly, the process must be inclusive and transparent, meaning that civil society, as well as humanitarian actors, frontline communities, are not treated as an afterthought, but as essential partners. And third, all reforms must be guided by impact and not just cost savings. And this is where some of the criticisms also emerge, and perhaps we'll get to some of those.
Why don't we talk about those right now? Are there some critiques of the package and some of the recommendations that were made?
Yes, to put bluntly.
Okay.
So I
The
think
floor is yours.
exactly. I think that one of the fears is that amid the severe and widening resource constraints that are not just driven by reductions from one major state contributor, whom I think we can guess, but by declining political commitment and arrears across multiple member states, that the UN 80 reform agenda risks further sidelining and cutting off at the knees, in fact, a retreat from some of the greatest aspirations of the UN system. For example, cuts across human rights mandates, consolidation of programs for gender with other marginalized communities, peacekeeping already being hardly resourced to fit the current needs at a time, of course, where there are more conflicts in the world and of such a grave nature as perhaps never before. These are real challenges that UN80 seeks to confront, but also suffers from in terms of its implementation. Moreover, civil society thus far, I think, has argued in some instances that it has been consulted on a limited basis, and perhaps has been has had the package presented to it, at least in this first phase, as a fait accompli. This is understandable due to a rush to meet internal deadlines and finalize work plans. But in recent consultations, many stakeholders felt they were being presented with a largely settled agenda. And so for this to succeed, I think UN80 must really move from consultation to co-creation. So there must be a continuous feedback loop and multi-stakeholder partnerships to truly drive reform forward.
That is so extremely important. You've got to have the input of all of the participants in order to make this successful. Well, we're going to come back in just a moment to talk about this and a lot more for the rest of our program. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows, you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking about probably the number one international institution out there that tries to bring all of the countries of the world together to deal with a wide range of problems, from diseases to climate change, you name it, the UN does it in one way or the other. And my guest today is an expert on this topic. Rebecca Shute is an international lawyer in democracy and in governance practitioner with extensive experience supporting human rights, democratic processes, and the rule of law. Rebecca, we're talking about the United Nations and how critical it is for the partners, really the 193 members of the General Assembly, to come together to coalesce and to work on these problems. There are quite a few voids that the UN right now vacuums, so to speak, especially with the United States pulling out of World Health Organization, with I think the Human Rights Commission, just our council, and just a variety of other areas. Why is it so important that we participate, that everybody participate? And if we don't, other countries will fill the void, especially China. We saw it 5 years ago at the UN when that happened. But how critical is that?
Well, I'd like to answer, I think, in two parts. The first being, it's not always a bad thing when other countries step up. You give the example of the People's Republic of China, but history also shows that progress doesn't stop when we, the United States, leave the room. That middle powers and coalitions of smaller states can assert themselves, and they have done so successfully to lead peacekeeping, climate initiatives, and humanitarian efforts. And so this demonstrates that multilateralism can survive and perhaps even thrive when responsibility is shared. Now, the second half of that answer that is how incredibly damaging and dangerous it is for the United States and indeed any state to withdraw from multilateral institutions and commitments. These are not merely political statements. They have real consequences for global stability. They have impacts upon the image and the reality of US influence at home and abroad, and they impact our ability to solve shared challenges. I'll just give a personal note that the first part of my career was spent in democratic development, largely with grantees and partners with institutions like the United States Agency for International Development and elements of the Department of State that no longer exist, along with other state, private, and philanthropic actors. And we saw in the first days of the shutdown and dismantling of USAID the profound humanitarian effects worldwide on the most vulnerable. And we will not know the consequences, the full consequences, perhaps for generations, of the loss of those incredibly important humanitarian mechanisms and levers for global cooperation. And the dangers go further than that. The United States still retains, of course, enormous leverage and has times used that leverage coercively. This morning, I was on a call where a colleague described a pattern of technological imperialism, quote unquote, where the United States has threatened to turn major tech allies against smaller states to pressure compliance. And then beyond technology, I think we're going to talk a little bit about international justice. And this coercion extends to the rule of law, the imposition of sanctions on officials of the International Criminal Court and human rights organizations in response to investigations targeting nationals. Impedes both accountability and the rule of law and sends a very chilling signal to the international community and to international lawyers and practitioners like myself, quite frankly. So the consequences are clear and they're real, and disengagement or coercion weakens these institutions, erodes trust, and reduces the global capacity to respond to crises or uphold norms.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like recently that just reading the articles and looking at the news and what have you, that the United States is into a period of coercion, blackmail, if you want to call it that, applying pressure, undue pressure through the use of tariffs and a variety of other sources too, cutting funding, and not only to other countries, but to states within the United States. And that is not the way we've done business before. But this rule of law, we've heard about this for years, and it is so critical. It's one of the reasons that so many companies want to invest in the United States. It's so many reasons that our partners used to want to partner with us, want to share information about what's going on in other parts of the world. That really our popularity, the U.S. government's popularity over the last 8 months has just gone from about 80, as I've read some of the polls, from in the 80s down in the 20s, and it's just crashed. How important is this rule of law? What is the rule of law? Let's talk about that first.
Well, so first and foremost, the rule of law exists not as an abstract concept. It can seem that way. And it can seem as though the institutions in The Hague or organs of the UN that deal with human rights in Geneva, even those in New York, for those of us in the United States, these can seem remote and they can seem conceptual. But these institutions and these processes exist for the vulnerable, they exist for victims, they exist so that when states themselves step out of line, either with regards to another state or with regards to their own citizens, and they begin to commit human rights abuses on them, that there is accountability, that there can't be impunity for the gravest crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. These are atrocity crimes for which there's individual personal jurisdiction under at the International Criminal Court. That when states violate either their treaty law or their obligations under by accepting compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, or under what we call Jus Cogens norms, norms that are so bedrock that they form part of the foundation of what we as humanity have come to accept as behavior, that they are held to account. And here, it's somewhat ironic that I think every class that I had in international law began with either the existential question of whether or not it even exists or whether it's dying. And you wouldn't think that those two things could go together, but I'm often reminded of the quote that's attributable, or widely attributed at least, to Mark Twain, that rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. So, I mean, I don't want to downplay the fact that international justice and the rule of law is facing serious, serious challenges right now. Challenges not only in the form of outright attacks on the court, like that of the United States or the Russian Federation to the ICC, but also non-compliance and non-cooperation. We have, in the case of the International Criminal Court, individuals with arrest warrants on them traveling to states' parties and not being detained. But in fact, in an interesting way, these challenges prove the rule that we have come to acknowledge the norms and the architecture that these institutions represent as alive, as something that should be upheld. And this shouldn't be taken for granted because it's a fairly recent phenomenon. When we think up until the late 19th century, in the first Hague Peace Conference in 1899, might makes right was not problematic in any way. But now that we face these challenges, we must find new levers to reinforce compliance. And so this year at the Assembly of States Parties to the International Criminal Court was the first ever debate on non-cooperation. At the International Court of Justice, campaigns such as one I lead, Legal Alternatives to War, are trying to encourage more states to accept compulsory jurisdiction. And we also have progress with regards to solving gaps in the international legal architecture. And this includes with respect to the foundational crime, the crime of aggression, where we see, of course, multiple instances in every region of the world, frankly. There are a couple obvious ones and many more that don't get the attention that perhaps they deserve, where state sovereignty is being impacted. And in fact, the promise of the UN to save the future generations from the scourge of war is being unheeded.
It certainly is, yes. Well, the UN was, as we mentioned earlier, was founded in 1945, and it's really been, as I perceive it, the linchpin of the multilateral cooperation over the last 80 years, so to speak. And it's just been critical with the Bretton Woods institutions, with the variety of programs that were provided back post 1945, World War II, and what's available today, or what was available until recently. But when you're posed with the question, is the UN relevant today? And we think back to the UN was created to eliminate the scourge of war, to promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights around the world. How do you've already responded to a large part of that, but how do you respond to people who say, well, the UN is useless, we don't use the UN? But the UN is still out there functioning every day with so many agencies that people know nothing about. And I'm talking about like moving ships, helping to move ships, aircraft, mail, weather information around the globe. These are all essential services. But how do you respond to that?
Yes, so I would start by saying that I think the mission is as relevant as ever. perhaps more relevant than in 1945, with all of the existential and planetary crises. It's often referred to as a triple planetary crisis that our planet faces, and the humanitarian crises in every corner of the world. However, at the same time, just yesterday at the UN Security Council, in a thematic debate on leadership for peace, former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon warned, with what I think I would call sober clarity, that without reform, the UN, and I'm going to quote, risks lurching toward irrelevance. And this is particularly true when its principal organs are unable to act when the world needs them the most. So when the former Secretary General of the United Nations is acknowledging that the situation has become significantly worse, in his words, than during his tenure, and that we face truly a threat to the system, the very survival of the UN as we know it, I think we have to take that seriously. We know the record of the United Nations in delivering over 8 decades is undeniable. And as you say, this includes the obvious, the prevention of world wars, the near eradication of smallpox and other deadly diseases, founding of norms against genocide and slavery, coordination of responses to poverty, famine, pandemic on a global level, which are not just achievements of bureaucratic machinery. They're a triumph of collective humanity. Whether or not we will be able to continue that, I think, depends on the ability of the United Nations to adapt. And while this is challenging, it is not impossible. So the warning that Ban Ki-moon gave is not a critique of the UN's purpose, but it's a plea for its effectiveness. And here's where some of the reform proposals, I think, that are on the table should be taken seriously. And we should remember that this is a human-made, but actually a man-made institution, remembering who was in San Francisco, only 5 women present, and of course, a majority of the states not in existence, and many of those that were in existence not represented. So it should not be seen as preserved in amber or immutable. And we can talk perhaps about what I see as some of the best hope for UN reform to give us a little bit of a more positive and forward-looking perspective on this pretty
That
serious threat that we see.
that is perfect. We have about 2 minutes left, and please tell the world what your recommendations are.
Thank you so much. So I think one of the major areas of concern has been the role of the Security Council. And we have seen in the 1960s the first expansion of the Security Council over the objections of P5 members. We know it can be done. And here there are thoughts to revisit the composition again. Beyond that, I think that what many people are aware of, even if they have only a glancing cognizance of the UN system, is how the veto power has been an instrument not to prevent war, but in fact to enable atrocities and aggression and to evade impunity. And here again, I just want to quote from Ban Ki-moon yesterday: without concrete reforms to curb the arbitrary use and misuse of the veto power, the United Nations sends a message that helplessness cannot be overcome, civilians will remain unprotected in conflict, impunity will still reign. Veto reform is absolutely necessary. I'm currently part of an effort to ask the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the existing legal limits to the veto. Other reforms are on the table. And in fact, in Article 109 conference, this is the article that envisioned revisiting the UN Charter shortly after its promulgation. That's now on the table as well. And last thought I could leave you with is we're going into an election year for a new Secretary General. And while there are several reforms that are being proposed for the process, including changing the term from 2 5-year terms, that basically mean that the Secretary General is in a campaign mode throughout his tenure, to a single 7-year term, greater transparency throughout the process. I think the single greatest point of consensus among many states and across civil society and other actors is that it is unacceptable that in 80 years of the United Nations, it has always been led by a man. And so there is a campaign, One for 8 billion, And maybe, I don't know, you can include links when this is put online, that seeks to support the first woman Secretary General. We, of course, also want greater geographical representation going forward. So these are some very credible and I think tangible and concrete areas of reform that could help them bring the UN into its next chapter and beyond its 80th year.
Becca, they certainly are. And unfortunately, we ran out of time. We'll have to get you back soon to talk about the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, two critical organizations in this world today. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.